The first time it happened, no one said anything out loud. A gray cat, thin-boned and unhurried, peered in the corridor of Maplewood Care Center on a Tuesday evening in October, walked without hesitation to room 14, and sat outside the closed door until just after midnight. At 12:17 a.m., the overnight nurse, a young woman named Brynn, who had been working that wing for less than 3 months, heard the call light from inside that room. By the time she reached it, there was nothing left to be done. Walter Odom, 81 years old, retired schoolteacher, grandfather of 7, had died quietly in his sleep. The cat was gone by morning. Nobody thought much of it. Animals wandered into care facilities. It happened. The maintenance supervisor mentioned he would check the side entrance again, because that was where the latch had been sticking all fall. And that was where the conversation ended. Until it happened again. 11 days later, the cat appeared at the door of room 22. This time, it was a Thursday. This time, 3 different staff members saw it sitting there in the early dark, its tail wrapped neatly around its front paws, its pale eyes aimed at nothing visible. The woman in room 22, Harriet Bowl, was 87. She had been declining slowly for months. She passed away at 4:44 in the morning. The cat was gone by the time the sun came through the windows. The third time, the staff counted hours. They started to watch, not officially. Nobody wrote anything down or said anything to the director. But the 2 nurses on the night rotation began noting when the cat appeared, and they began timing. Because whatever else was true, whatever explanation anyone wanted to reach for, one thing could not be disputed. The cat always arrived before, not after, not during, before. It sat outside the door of a patient who was going to die, and it sat there until they did, and then it was gone. The cat had no name. It had no collar. Nobody knew where it came from or where it went. It appeared at dusk through some entrance nobody ever managed to catch it using, and it vanished before the morning staff arrived for their shift. In the 8 months since anyone had first noticed it, it had appeared 7 times. 7 times, a patient had died within hours of the cat choosing their door. 7 for 7. The staff had not told the families. They had not told the administration. They had told each other in the break room, and in the parking lot, and in hushed voices over the nurse's station. And the agreement, unspoken and unanimous, was that they would keep it that way. What would they say? That a stray cat had become something like a premonition. That something 4-legged and inexplicable was doing what no physician, no monitor, no carefully reviewed chart had been able to do, which was to know. And then, on a Wednesday in late March, Dr. Nolan Voss arrived. He was 34 years old. He had been brought in from a practice in Portland to serve as the facility's new attending physician, replacing Dr. Harmon, who had retired after 22 years in the position. Voss drove a gray sedan, or dark-framed glasses he had a habit of removing when he thought, and carried himself with the slightly over-controlled manner of someone who had learned early that confidence was the first thing people needed from a doctor, whether it was justified or not. He had reviewed all the patient files before his first day. He had read everything there was to read about Maplewood. He had not read anything about the cat. He started on a Monday. By the following Wednesday, he had met most of the residents, reviewed medication schedules, made 3 adjustments to treatment plans, and introduced himself to every staff member on every shift. He was thorough. He was formal. He was clearly competent in a particular, contained way that made experienced nurses feel uncertain about him, not because he seemed wrong, but because he seemed too consistent, too careful, too little given to the small human looseness that tends to make people feel trusted. Brynn watched him without meaning to, in the way you watch someone you haven't yet decided about. What she did not know about Voss, and what he had not volunteered to anyone at Maplewood, was that he had not come to this position entirely by choice. He had left Portland after a period of time he described to no one in specifics, a year in which he had filed a formal complaint at the hospital group where he'd worked, alleging systemic failures in ICU documentation protocols, and had spent 14 months watching that complaint get reviewed, appealed, reviewed again, and ultimately classified as outside the purview of the oversight committee to which it had been submitted. He had not lost his license. He had not been censured. He had simply been made to understand, through the slow and impersonal machinery of institutional response, that the hospital would not be changing its protocols, that his concerns had been noted, and that his contract would not be renewed. He had taken the Maplewood position because it was offered, because it was far enough from Portland, because long-term care was as far from an ICU as medicine allowed, and he needed, for reasons he was not yet able to articulate clearly, to be somewhere that moved at a different pace. He had not expected to care about it as much as he did almost immediately. There was something about long-term care that medicine did not always tell you about in training, which was that the patients were people in a way that was unambiguous. They had histories. They had opinions. They had favorite chairs and least favorite foods and memories that surfaced at unexpected moments, and things they wanted to talk about that had nothing to do with their diagnosis. In an ICU, the urgency collapsed everything into the medical present. In a place like Maplewood, a physician was asked to know a person, not just a case, and Voss found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was good at this. That the same quality that had made him unpopular in Portland, the inability to abstract individual patients into system-level statistics, was here something closer to a gift. He was reviewing Edmund Farr's medication schedule on a Tuesday afternoon when Farr himself interrupted to tell him about a fishing trip he had taken in 1971 to a lake in northern Montana that Voss had also visited for entirely different reasons in 2009. They spent 40 minutes talking about this lake, its specific quality of light in early morning, the way the mountains came down to the edge of it, and Voss left the room running behind on his afternoon rounds and did not regret it at all. He thought about Edmund Farr at odd moments in the weeks that followed. He thought about him the way you think about people you have unexpectedly connected with, the small private awareness that here is a person who matters, which in a place like Maplewood was both the most ordinary thing and the most necessary thing, and which had to be held carefully because it could not be the basis for clinical decisions, but could not be fully separated from them either. It was Brynn who first noticed what the cat did next. She had been finishing her notes at the station on the second floor when she heard the particular sound the old elevator made, the soft mechanical hesitation before the doors opened, and she looked up, and the cat was there in the corridor, not outside any patient's room, in the middle of the hallway, sitting still the way it always sat, but oriented differently, turned in a direction it had never turned before, toward the administrative wing, toward the temporary office they had set up for Dr. Voss. Brynn sat very still at the nurse's station. She told herself she was misreading the angle. The corridor bent slightly there, and the light from the exit sign gave things a reddish cast that changed how shadows fell. And she was tired. She had been on since 4 in the afternoon, and she was almost certainly misreading the angle. The cat sat outside Dr. Voss's office for 47 minutes. Then it walked back down the corridor, turned toward the elevator, and was gone. It had not been outside a patient's room. Brynn did not sleep when she got home that morning. She lay in her bed with the blinds half closed and thought about what it meant, or what it could mean, and found that her mind kept offering her explanations, and then taking them back. The cat had smelled something. The cat had heard something. The cat was simply a cat, and the previous 7 deaths had been coincidence. And she had been working nights for too long, and was building patterns out of darkness the way the human brain always did when it was tired and frightened. She told herself all of these things. She did not believe them. what she could not stop returning to, lying there with the thin morning light coming through the gap in the blinds, was the orientation. Not just that the cat had been in the corridor, but the specific way it had been sitting, tail wrapped, eyes forward. The posture it used outside the patient rooms, the watchful stillness of it, the same quality of attention it brought to the doors behind which people were dying. It had aimed that posture at Voss's office. Brynn had been a nurse for 6 years. She had done 2 years in an emergency department before taking a night rotation at Maplewood, and she was not someone who frightened easily or who reached for unusual explanations when straightforward ones were available. She believed in science. She believed in protocol. She believed that when patients died, it was because of processes that could be traced and understood, not because a cat had foreknowledge of anything. She had believed all of this without particular effort for the entirety of her career. She was finding it harder to believe it now. The question that kept arriving and refusing to leave was not whether the cat knew something. The question was whether it mattered what category you put that knowledge in. She had watched, in 6 years of nursing, the way families reached for meaning in the wake of a death, the way they constructed narratives out of small details, a word spoken, a gesture repeated, a feeling they had the day before. She had been trained to receive those narratives with care and not to interrogate them, because the stories people told about the deaths of people they loved were part of how grief processed itself. They were not lies. They were the mind doing its necessary work. But this was not a family member reaching for meaning. This was multiple staff members, trained and experienced, observing a consistent pattern over years. This was data. This was something closer to evidence than anything she had wanted to call it. She fell asleep around noon with the photocopied intake form on the knitstand beside her and the expression on the cat in the photograph sitting somewhere behind her eyelids. There was a nurse at Maplewood who had worked there for 19 years. Her name was Celestin, and she had the particular quality of long-serving care workers, which is that she had seen enough that very little surprised her. But what did surprise her, she took seriously. Celestin had grown up in a household where her grandmother, a Haitian woman who had lived to 94 and never doubted a thing she felt, had taught her that the world was wider than the parts of it that had been formally categorized, and that the appropriate response to something you couldn't explain was not dismissal, but attention. Celestin had carried this as a private thing, not something she advertised at work, not something she expected her colleagues to share, but a quality of openness she kept in reserve for the moments that seemed to ask for it. When Brynn found her the next morning in the break room and told her what she had seen, Celestin listened the entire way through without interrupting. Then she set down her coffee. She said she needed to tell Brynn something she had never said out loud. The first time the cat had appeared at Maplewood, Celestin said, was not 8 months ago. It was 4 years ago. She had seen it herself once, when she was covering a late shift on a wing she didn't usually work. A gray cat outside room 8. She had mentioned it to the charge nurse on that floor, who had shrugged and said it was probably a stray, and they'd deal with it in the morning. The patient in room 8, a retired postman named Floyd Abernethy, died at 3:00 a.m. Celestin had told herself the same things Brynn had told herself. She had told herself those things for 4 years, and she had not told anyone because there was nothing to tell. It was a stray cat and a dying man and a coincidence that had lodged in her memory, because grief does strange things to the mind. But here was what she had never said out loud. She knew the cat, not as a facility stray. From before, she had seen a cat matching that description at the home of a patient she had visited informally, a woman named Gotti Creech, who had lived 2 streets over from the Maplewood property before being transferred here 3 years ago. Dottie had died in Maplewood 6 months after her arrival. Her family had not come to collect her things. Her cat had not been accounted for. Celestin had visited Dottie twice at her home before the transfer, part of the informal pre-admission outreach that some of the longer-serving staff did, getting a sense of where a new resident was coming from, what mattered to them, what they would miss. Dottie had been a woman of routines and small specific attachments. She had shown Celestin her garden, the particular variety of rose she had tended for 30 years, the kitchen where she made tea at the same time every afternoon, the cat that slept on the arm of the sofa and regarded everything with faint displeasure. Dottie had called the cat Mist. She had said she wasn't worried about herself. She had known for some time that her body was making its final decisions, but she worried about Mist. She said Mist had always been particular about people, and it took time. Celestin had said she was sure they could make arrangements. They had not. The transfer had happened quickly, more quickly than anyone had anticipated, and in the logistics of it, the cat had not been mentioned again. Dottie had arrived at Maplewood with one suitcase and a photograph, and died there 6 months later, and no one had gone back to ask what had happened to the rose garden, or the kitchen, or the cat named Mist that had been particular about people and took time. Celestin had assumed the cat had been taken in by a neighbor or found by a rescue. She had not assumed it was still here. She had not assumed it had stayed. Brynn drove past Dottie Creech's former address on her way home that afternoon. She did not know exactly why. The house was occupied now. A young couple had bought it the previous spring. There was a child's tricycle on the porch. The garden had been replanted. None of this meant anything except that Dottie Creech had lived here once, in a house with a gray cat, and the gray cat had stayed behind when Dottie was taken to die somewhere else. That night, Brynn went back to the nurse's station and pulled Dottie Creech's file. There was a photograph clipped to the intake form. Standard practice at Maplewood, a simple photo to personalize the record. The photo showed a woman in her late 70s, white-haired and narrow-shouldered, seated at a kitchen table. On the table in front of her was a gray cat. The cat in the photograph was thin-boned, pale-eyed, and looking directly at the camera with an expression that Brynn could not quite name and could not quite shake. She stared at that photograph for a long time. The cat in the photo had a small dark mark on its left ear, a smudge of darker fur just below the fold. She had not noticed this before on the cat she'd seen in the corridor. But she had not been looking. She told herself she had not been looking. She photocopied the intake form and put it in her bag and went home and could not explain, even to herself, exactly what she thought she was doing. Dr. Voss found out about the cat not from Brynn and not from Celestin, but from a family member. A woman named Priya, whose grandmother Cybele was a resident on the second floor, had been visiting every Sunday for 3 years. She was in her late 30s, practical and composed in the way of people who have been caring for an ill family member long enough to have run through all their feelings and arrived at something steadier on the other side. She had heard about the cat from one of the other family members in the common room. She brought it up with Dr. Voss at the end of a routine update conversation, almost as an afterthought, the way people attach the most important things they want to say at the very end because they are not sure how they will be received. She said she had heard there was a cat. She said she had heard it appeared outside the rooms of patients before they died. She looked at him with clear, steady eyes and said she wanted to know what he thought about that. Voss was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the quiet of someone choosing carefully between several things they could say. He told her he had not heard about the cat. She said she was surprised by that. He said he would look into it. He said this the way doctors are trained to say things that are not promises, but function as promises. And Priya heard the distinction clearly, and thanked him and left. And Voss sat in his temporary office for the rest of that afternoon, turning the conversation over in a way he would not have been able to fully explain. He sat with it the way he had learned to sit with things in Portland, which was to let them exist as facts before deciding what they meant. Priya was not a credulous person. He had been meeting with her weekly for nearly a month, and she asked precise questions and received answers with a quality of scrutiny that made it clear she was tracking everything. She was not someone who would mention a rumor about an animal unless she had thought it through and decided it was worth mentioning. And she had mentioned it at the end of the conversation, not the beginning, which meant she had been sitting with it through the rest of their exchange and finally decided to say it. He did not dismiss this. He started asking questions that evening, not of Brynn, not of Celestin. He started with maintenance, then housekeeping, then the evening shift aides. He was methodical. He asked each person separately, in ways that would not suggest to them what answer he was looking for, because he had learned in his years as a physician that people told you what they thought you wanted to hear if you gave them enough to go on, and he wanted the raw account, not the accommodated one. What he gathered, piece by piece over 4 days of conversations, was consistent to a degree that he found difficult to attribute to shared mythology. 6 different people, on different shifts, some of whom barely overlapped with each other socially, described the cat in identical physical terms: gray, thin, pale-eyed, a specific way of sitting with the tail wrapped. 3 of them described it entering or leaving through the side entrance. 4 of them had been present on the floor when the cat appeared and had subsequently been present when the patient died. None of them had been the one to put the information together as a pattern. They each, it seemed, had held their peace in relative isolation, unsure what to do with it, and had not compared notes in any systematic way. He was constructing a timeline before he decided what the timeline meant, which was how he had always approached things he didn't understand. He had been this way since medical school, where his professors had called it his greatest strength and occasionally his most frustrating quality, depending on the situation. By the end of the week, he had confirmed the following. The cat had been seen at Maplewood by multiple staff members over a period of at least 8 months, possibly longer. It appeared to enter through the side entrance on the ground floor, possibly through a gap in the doorframe that maintenance had identified and never fully resolved. It appeared reliably at night. It had been seen outside the rooms of at least 7 patients, who subsequently died within hours of its appearance. It did not behave aggressively and had never been captured or closely examined. He wrote this all down in a notebook he kept in his bag. He was not sure what column to put it in. He was trained in evidence. He had spent 12 years building a relationship with evidence, understanding what it could and could not establish, knowing when to trust it and when it was leading you somewhere you needed to check again. And the evidence here was, in its own strange way, consistent. 7 appearances, 7 deaths. The data was not ambiguous. What was ambiguous was what it meant. He did not go looking for the cat. He told himself this was because there was no clinical reason to, and because his attention needed to stay on the patients who were currently under his care, and because a stray animal wandering a care facility was ultimately a facilities management issue, not a medical one. He told himself these things in precisely the way Brynn had told herself things, and with approximately the same degree of success. He found, in the weeks after he began documenting the pattern, that he was sleeping worse. Not anxiously, not with dread, but with the specific restlessness of someone who has encountered an incomplete equation and cannot locate the missing variable. He would lie awake in the spare room he was renting by the month and run through what he knew and where the gaps were, the way he had done in Portland during the months when the complaint was being reviewed, when he had known something was wrong and had all the pieces except the ones that were being kept from him. The sensation was familiar enough to be alarming. He had followed the right channels in Portland and been overruled. He had documented and submitted and waited, and the machinery had absorbed his documentation and returned. Verdict he could not accept, but could not override. He had left because he could not think of what else to do, and that doing nothing had started to feel like something worse than leaving. He thought about this more than he wanted to while he waited to understand what the cat was telling him. Because it was telling him something. He had abandoned the pretense of scientific neutrality on this point, approximately 2 weeks after the notebook started filling up. Something in this building was wrong. He did not need a cat to tell him that. He had enough professional experience to feel it at the edges of things, in the way certain conversations ended too quickly, in the way certain complaints were summarized in charts with a tone of dismissal that should not have fit, in the way Edmund Farr's daughter's concern about overnight monitoring had been filed and never followed up on. These were small things, each individually dismissible. Together, they had the texture of a place that had stopped watching itself closely enough. The cat had appeared at those rooms before anyone else had noticed. He did not know how. He had theories, clinical ones, olfactory, that cats could detect physiological changes that preceded death by hours, elevated ketones, specific metabolic shifts that human senses could not register. There was documented research on this. Animals perceiving death was not supernatural. It was sensory. It was biology. What he could not explain clinically was why the cat had come to his office. He was not dying. The cat came back on a Friday night, 12 days after it had sat outside Voss's office. It came back to the second floor, which it had visited once before, and it sat outside room 29. The resident of room 29 was a man named Edmund Farr, who was 92 years old and had been declining for 2 months in a way that had been noted in his chart and discussed at the previous care meeting, and whose family had been spoken to about what the next weeks might bring. Edmund Farr was not a surprise, but the cat, as always, was 12 to 14 hours ahead of what the chart had predicted. Edmund Farr passed away at 7:22 that Saturday morning. Voss reviewed the chart Sunday. He noted the timing. He wrote nothing in the notebook. And then, 2 weeks later, the cat did not go to a patient's room. It was a Monday. Brynn was on. She had gotten into the habit, without quite deciding to, of watching the camera feed from the side entrance on the second monitor at the nurse's station, the one that was usually used to display patient alert status. The camera quality was poor, grainy, and low contrast, but adequate to show movement in the corridor. She saw the cat appear at 9:47 p.m. She watched it move down the hallway. She held her breath as it passed room 26, then 28, then 31, and then it stopped. It stopped at the intersection of the main corridor and the wing that led to the physician offices. It turned left. It went to Dr. Voss's office again. Brynn was on her feet before she decided to stand. She went down the corridor. She turned left at the intersection. She came around the corner, and the cat was there, outside the closed office door, and it turned its head when she appeared. She could see the mark on its left ear from where she was standing, the small dark smudge just below the fold. She crouched down slowly. The cat watched her. It did not move away. It did not approach. It held its position with the same steady watchfulness it brought to the patient doors, that quality of absolute patience, as if it had been here before and would be here again, and had no particular relationship with hurry. Brynn had been in this building for 2 years. She had been on nights for all of it, which meant she knew this hallway in the particular way you know places you have only ever seen in artificial light. The specific yellow cast of the fluorescence, the way the linoleum had a slight give near the water fountain, the angle at which the exit sign projected its red wash across the far wall. She knew the sounds this building made at different hours, the settling of it, the murmur of machines, the particular silence of 3 in the morning, which was different from the silence of midnight or the silence of 5. She thought about Dottie Creech, who had lived 2 streets over and died here in a facility far from her kitchen table, without her family, without her cat, and with very little ceremony. She thought about a gray cat that had stayed for 3 years after its person was gone, appearing at the edges of this building like a question that nobody had thought to answer correctly. She thought about what Celestine had said. It did not go to the dying, not always. Sometimes, Celestine had said, and she had paused before this, sometimes it goes to the ones who need to understand something. Brynn had not known what to do with that when Celestine said it. She still did not know what to do with it. But she was crouching in a dim corridor in the middle of the night, with a gray cat watching her from outside a doctor's door. And she was, for the first time in several weeks, not afraid. She was something adjacent to afraid. A state she did not have a name for. A feeling like standing at the edge of understanding something. Like the word is on the tip of your tongue, but it isn't a word. It's a whole situation. And it is trying to come into focus. She knocked. The light under the door, which she had not noticed until then, went dark. There was a pause, then footsteps. The door opened. Voss stood there with his dark-framed glasses in his hand and the look of someone who had been sitting in the room for a long time before she arrived. He looked at her. He looked at the cat. He looked back at her. He said, "It came again." Not as a question. She said, "You already knew." He did not deny it. He stepped back from the door, and she followed him in, and the cat remained outside in the corridor, maintaining its watch. Voss's temporary office had the look of a place someone had been working in for a long time, which was strange because he had only been here 2 months. The desk was covered in organized stacks of paper. A whiteboard on the wall behind the chair had been written on and partially erased several times, the ghost of previous notations still visible beneath the current ones. On the edge of the desk, the notebook she hadn't known he was keeping. He said he had been sitting there for 2 hours, since midnight, because he had started reading the death records more carefully, going back 4 years instead of 8 months, and he had found something he had not expected. Not about the cat, about the patients. He moved 3 folders from the desk to the spare chair in the room, transferring them carefully, and Brynn understood from this that he had been holding them, that he had been sitting in here with these 3 folders in his lap, going over whatever was inside them. He said every patient the cat had visited in the past 4 years had one thing in common. Not age, not diagnosis, not room assignment or length of stay. They all had, at some point during their time at Maplewood, submitted a complaint to the administration. Some were minor, dietary, or scheduling. 2 were significant, documenting medication concerns that had been reviewed and dismissed. 1, the most recent, had been filed by Edmund Farr's daughter on his behalf 8 months ago. She had documented what she believed was a pattern of inadequate overnight monitoring on the 2nd floor. That complaint had been reviewed and dismissed. Edmund Farr had died on a Saturday morning, while the night shift was understaffed by 1. Brynn sat down. She thought about the photocopied form in her bag at the nurse's station. She thought about Dottie Creech's complaint, if there had been one, and the way the intake records from 4 years ago were not the kind of thing anyone revisited. She thought about how long something could go unreviewed simply because the people most harmed by it were too old, too sick, or too alone to make it heard. She thought about a gray cat that had stayed in a building for 3 years after the person it loved had died unheard inside it. Voss said he was not accusing anyone. He said he did not have enough to accuse anyone. He said what he had was a pattern and a question at a facility that had, over the course of 4 years, lost 12 patients, several of whom had concerns that had not been properly heard, and a stray cat that apparently knew which rooms to visit long before the monitors alarmed. He said he was going to take this to the State Oversight Board on Monday. He looked at her in the way that people look when they are waiting for a response they are not sure they will get. She said, "I'll write down everything I've seen." She said it before she had fully decided to, the way some of the most important decisions in a person's life arrive, not as considered choices, but as recognitions, as the understanding that the decision has already been made somewhere beneath the level of deliberation, and what is happening now is just the catching up. He said he had not been sure until he opened that door and saw the cat outside it, whether he was going to go alone. The cat was not in the corridor when they came back out. Neither of them had heard it leave. The building was quiet, and the exit sign cast its red light on the floor, and there was no gray shape in the hallway in either direction. Brynn went back to the nurse's station and sat there for the remaining 3 hours of her shift. And though she checked on every patient twice more before dawn, she spent most of that time writing in the small notebook she kept in her bag, the one she used for personal notes and grocery lists and phone numbers, writing out what she had seen and when, from the first time she'd noticed the cat in the corridor on a rainy Tuesday all the way to this morning, with dates where she had them, and approximate times where she didn't. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she had 7 pages, and her handwriting had gotten slightly larger as she went, the way it did when she was concentrated and not paying attention to the size of the letters. She left the notebook at the nurse's station with a note on top that said Voss on the outside. He found it at 6:30 when he came in early. He read it at his desk before his first rounds. Then he made a call he had been composing in his head since 2 in the morning. What they found over the following 3 months was not traumatic in the way investigations are sometimes portrayed. It was methodical and slow and bureaucratic and very thorough. 3 systematic deficiencies were documented. 2 were administrative, related to complaint handling procedures and staffing protocols. 1 was more serious. A pattern of overnight monitoring gaps that had existed, according to reconstructed schedules and records, for approximately 4 years. Not malfeasance in the criminal sense. Negligence in the quieter sense, the kind that accumulates in facilities where understaffing is chronic and oversight is infrequent, and the families of elderly patients are worn down and easy to dismiss. Voss gave testimony twice, once in a formal proceeding and once in a follow-up review. Both times he was asked about the original source of his concerns, and both times he said he had reviewed the death records and the complaint files systematically and found a pattern that warranted reporting. Both times the investigators accepted this answer without pressing further. He did not mention the cat, not because he was hiding it, but because he understood, with the clarity of someone who had already filed one complaint that had been dismissed, that the credibility of the findings was the thing that mattered, and the findings were substantial enough to stand without any discussion of the gray cat that may or may not have known about them first. Brynn did not mention the cat either. In her written account, she described the dates and times she had observed the animal in the corridor, and correlated those dates with the subsequent deaths, presenting it as anomalous behavior worthy of note. No one in the review process asked her to elaborate. The oversight board was focused on the staffing records and the complaint documentation. The cat was a footnote. It was a footnote that both Brynn and Voss thought about for a long time after. Changes were required. A new monitoring protocol was implemented. 2 administrative positions were restructured. 3 family complaints were formally reopened and reviewed, and the families received written acknowledgments that their concerns had been valid and had not been adequately addressed. Priya received one of those letters on behalf of her grandmother, Cybele, whose complaint 3 years earlier about medication timing had been dismissed. Cybele was still alive, still resident at Maplewood, and Priya read her the letter on a Sunday afternoon. She said her grandmother listened without particular expression, and then said it was about time. She asked if they wanted tea. It was not justice in the way that word is used in stories. It was smaller than that. It was the kind of accountability that exists in the real world, partial and procedural, and never quite equal to what it was meant to correct. But it was something, and something Brynn had learned in 6 years of nursing was often the most that could be asked of a situation that had gone wrong over years before anyone with authority to change it walked through the door. Brynn transferred to days 6 months later, not because of what had happened, but because her mother's health had changed and she needed a different schedule. On her last night shift, she walked the corridor one final time before clocking out. She was not looking for the cat. She had not seen it since the night outside Voss's office. She came around the corner near the side entrance and stopped. The cat was sitting by the door, not in the corridor, not near any room. At the exterior door, which stood slightly ajar the way it always had, the gap that maintenance had never fully closed. It was sitting with its back to her, looking out into the early gray of the morning. She stood there for a moment and did not say anything, because she did not know what to say, and because some things do not need to be said to be understood. Then the door opened fully in a small gust of outside air, and the cat walked through it, and the door eased back to its usual gap. And Brynn stood alone in the corridor, listening to the building breathe around her. She waited. The cat did not come back. Celestin told her later, weeks after, that no one had seen it since that night. Not on any floor, not at any door. The side entrance latch had finally been repaired in the spring. The facility had been upgraded and restaffed. New nurses had come on who had never heard of the cat and would not have believed it if someone told them. And the older staff, the ones who remembered, did not bring it up much anymore, not because they had stopped believing it, but because it had shifted into a different category in their minds, the category of things that happened and could not be fully explained and did not need to be, because the effects of them were real enough. What no one knew, because the intake records for former residents were not the kind of things staff routinely revisited after 4 years, was that Dottie Creech had submitted a complaint 2 weeks before her death. It had been logged. It had been filed. It had never been reviewed. Her cat had stayed. And for 4 years, in the corridors of a building where the woman it had belonged to had died unheard, it had been doing the only thing left available to it, which was to keep showing up and to mark the doors and to wait outside the office of anyone who might finally be paying attention. It knew before anyone else. That was the part nobody could explain, and the part nobody stopped thinking about. It always knew.